This is the Peter Pan story, roughly speaking. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle-class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality. She accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. But the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. And I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you, because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young. It's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So, part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. Like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. If you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart. So that's very wise thing to know. So, yeah. Sacrifice. You get to pick your damn sacrifice. That's all. You don't get to not make one. You're sacrificial whether you want to be or not. That's a good thing to know as well. Write down what bothers you. There's going to be things about life, about the current political situation,
about the details of your personal life, your relationships with other people that bother you. Now, a million things could bother you, and some things do. Those are your problems. And your destiny is in your problems. And then I would also say, well, watch yourself for a couple of weeks and see what you're doing when what you're doing appears meaningful, right? When your interest is gripped and you're compelled. Because when you're in the place where you are, when your interest is compelled and you're gripped, you're where you should be. And one of the things you want to learn is how to be there more. You have to kind of treat yourself like a stranger to figure that out because, well, as you said, you haven't been able to find your path precisely. Well, that means you don't know who the hell you are. Well, that's what it means fundamentally. You may know some things about yourself, but you don't know yourself as deeply as you might. You have to understand that there's a certain degree of arbitrary strangeness about you and about the things that will compel you and grip you. And you need to discover what those are. And paying attention can help. It's like, where am I when I think I'm where I should be? And what am I doing? And you can ask yourself that over a 2-week period or a 1-month period, like you're asking someone you don't know. Imagine 5 years from now. And I literally mean imagine this. Okay, imagine 5 years from now. Now, here's the deal. You can have what you want and you need, and you can be who you want to be. But you have to figure out what that is. That's the price you have to pay. So now you have to fantasize. It's like, okay, if I was who I would want to be, and if I had what I needed and I wanted, what would that look like? Write it down for 15 minutes. You're not going to get it right. Just sketch it out. And then you can do the opposite, which is, all right, now if I let my bad habits and inadequacies have the upper hand and order me in, what sort of hell could I occupy in 5 years? That's useful to know too, because that's a good way of specifying where you don't want to go. The first part of the exercise helps you specify where you do want to go. The second part helps you specify where you don't want to go. Then you have something to run away from and something to run toward, and that's good for maximizing motivation. And then the rest of the exercise helps people strategize. And so you might say, well, I don't exactly know who I want to be or where I want to be or what I want. And I would say, well, here's some hints. If your intimate relationship with what you wanted, what would it look like? If your friendships were constructed the way you wanted them to be, these are questions you have to ask yourself. What would that look like? If you were educated to the limits of your intelligence, what educational strategy would you have to pursue? What job or career would you want or need if you could have what you wanted or needed? How should you use your time outside of work? How would you take care of yourself mentally and physically? What services might you render to your family and your community if you could do it in the manner you wanted? That's 7 different questions, to sort of differentiate your life. Man, it's worth spending a few days figuring that out. We did that with university students before they went to university, and it dropped their dropout rate 50%. 90 minutes of writing dropped their dropout rate 50% and raised their grade point average 35%. So you need a vision, man. You need a vision. And you can develop a vision by pursuing what's interesting to you. You can develop a vision by taking the problems that beset you seriously. And you can develop a vision by working with yourself to develop a vision. Let's say you love someone. Maybe you have a friend, maybe it's your wife, maybe a child, and you really love this person, and you say to them, I really like to know what you want, and knowing that, maybe I can figure out how to help you. If you would let me know. You can ask yourself the same damn question. Imagine that you dared to assume that you were worth attending to, and that it would be okay if things worked out optimally for you in the best possible way. Just imagine for a moment that was okay. Well, then you could ask yourself, well, all right, what would that look like? That's an unbelievably useful exercise. That's a prayer, man. That's a prayer fundamentally. And that's a prayer devoted towards the seeking of a revelation.
Perhaps you should also be positioning yourself for a lateral move into another job, for example, noting as you may, this occupation is deadening my soul
and that is truly not for me. It is time to take the painstaking steps necessary to organize my CV and to engage in the difficult, demanding, and often unrewarding search for a new job. But you have to be successful only once. Maybe you can find something that pays better and is more interesting, and where you are working with people who not only fail to kill your spirit, but positively rejuvenate it. Maybe following the dictates of conscience is in fact the best possible plan that you have. At minimum, otherwise you have to live with your sense of self-betrayal and the knowledge that you put up with what you truly could not tolerate. Nothing about that is good. I might get fired. Well, prepare now to seek out and ready yourself for another job, hopefully better. Or prepare yourself to go over your manager's head with a well-prepared and articulate argument. And do not begin by presuming that leaving your job, even involuntarily, is necessarily for the worst. I am afraid to move. Well, of course you are, but afraid compared to what? Afraid in comparison to continuing in a job where the center of your being is at stake, where you become weaker, more contemptible, more bitter, and more prone to pressure and tyranny over the years. There are few choices in life where there is no risk on either side, and it is often necessary to contemplate the risks of staying as thoroughly as the risks of moving. I have seen many people move, sometimes after several years of strategizing, and end up in better shape, psychologically and pragmatically after their time in the desert. Perhaps no one else would want me. Well, the rejection rate for new job applications is extraordinarily high. I tell my clients to assume 50.1, so their expectations are set properly. You are going to be passed over, in many cases, for many positions for which you are qualified. But that is rarely personal. It is, instead, a condition of existence, an inevitable consequence of somewhat arbitrary subjection to the ambivalent conditions of worth characterizing society. It is the consequence of the fact that CVs are easy to disseminate and difficult to process, that many jobs have unannounced internal candidates and so are just going through the motions, and that some companies keep a rolling stock of applicants in case they need to hire quickly. That is an actuarial problem, a statistical problem, a baseline problem, and not necessarily an indication that there is something specifically flawed about you. You must incorporate all that sustainingly pessimistic realism into your expectations so that you do not become unreasonably downhearted. 150 applications, carefully chosen, 3 to 5 interviews thereby acquired. That could be a mission of a year or more. That is much less than a lifetime of misery and downward trajectory. But it is not nothing. You need to fortify yourself for it, plan, and garner support from people who understand what you are up to and are realistically appraised of the difficulty and the options. Now, it may also be that you are lagging in the development of your skills and could improve your performance at work, so that your chances of being hired elsewhere are heightened. But there is no loss in that. You cannot effectively pronounce no in the presence of corrupt power when your options to move are non-existent. In consequence, you have a moral obligation to place yourself in a position of comparative strength and to do then what is necessary to capitalize on that strength. You may also have to think through worst-case situations and to discuss them with those who will be affected by your decisions. But it is once again worth realizing that staying where you should not be may be the true worst-case situation, one that drags you out and kills you slowly over decades. That is not a good death, even though it is slow, and there is very little in it that does not speak of the hopelessness that makes people age quickly and long for the cessation of career and, worse, life. That is no improvement. As the old and cruel cliche goes, if you must cut off a cat's tail, do not do it half an inch at a time. You may well be in for a few painful years of belated recognition of insufficiency and required to send out 4 or 5 or 10 job applications a week. knowing full well that the majority will be rejected with less than a second look. But you need to win the lottery only once, and a few years of difficulty with hope beat an entire dejected lifetime of a degenerating and oppressed career. And let us be clear, it is not a simple matter of hating your job because it requires you to wake up too early in the morning, or to drag yourself to work when it is too hot or cold or windy or dry, or when you are feeling low and want to curl up in bed. It is not a matter of frustration generated when you are called on to do things that are menial or necessary, such as emptying garbage cans, sweeping floors, cleaning bathrooms, or in any other manner taking your lowly but well-deserved place at the bottom of the hierarchy of competence, even of seniority. Resentment generated by such necessary work is most often merely ingratitude, inability to accept a lowly place at the beginning, unwillingness to adopt the position of the fool, or arrogance and lack of discipline. Refusal of the call of conscience is by no means the same thing as irritation about undesirably low status. That rejection, that betrayal of the soul, is truly the requirement to perform demonstrably counterproductive, absurd, or pointless work, to treat others unjustly and to lie about it, to engage in deceit, to betray your future self, to put up with unnecessary torture and abuse, and to silently watch others suffer the same treatment. That rejection is the turning of a blind eye and the agreement to say and do things that betray your deepest values and make you a cheat at your own game. And there is no doubt that the road to hell, personally and socially, is paved not so much with good intentions as with the adoption of attitudes and undertaking of actions that inescapably disturb your conscience. Do not do what you hate.
It's not obvious to me that people themselves think that they're valuable all the time. Often they don't think that at all. They certainly don't think that often when they're depressed. They certainly don't think that when they're suicidal. They don't really think that when they're ashamed or guilty or frustrated or disappointed or angry or waking up at 3 a.m. and tormenting themselves with their consciences. They don't necessarily think that when they're fighting with their family or when they're upset at work or, when things go wrong in life. And so it's not so bloody obvious that people are inherently valuable. And then you might also notice that it's kind of easy to think that some people are more valuable than others. It's very easy for human beings to think that about other human beings because no matter where you look in human societies, there are rank orders of value, right? In any hierarchy that we produce that's associated with some ability, we find that some people are so much better at whatever it is that they're doing that it's an absolute miracle, and most people are absolutely dreadful at it. And so, if you were thinking about inherent value as an approximation of skill or competence, then it wouldn't be obvious from the structure of the world that people were inherently valuable in that manner either, because there's such a rank order difference in our ability to do things. And you might say, well, that kind of averages out across things, but I don't think that's a very strong argument either. So it's not obvious where this idea that people are inherently valuable came from. That's a tough one. In fact, I think it's one of the least obvious concepts that human beings have ever come up with, that each of us is to be attributed some divine spark, let's say, that makes us equal in some fundamental way before God, before the reality of the universe itself, even in relationship to our own laws. I mean, if you want a miracle for an idea, I can't think of one that's more unlikely than that. So I've been puzzling over that for a very long time because I cannot understand how in the world we ever agreed to act as if it was true. It's really something. It's a remarkable, fundamental idea. And what's so interesting about it, too, is that once you have that idea, weird as it is and improbable as it is, and you start to organize your social relationships in accordance with it, well, then they work. My rule, too, is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping. And it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which
I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else. Regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence, you're duty-bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better. And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it gets happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you and shame that's there otherwise saying, you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth, even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement. It seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot. Because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, their right to suicide, that, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well, then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you'd tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult than that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard. The self-recrimination, it's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. I mean, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that might work, but it doesn't work, and that's strange. And this is one of the reasons I love the psychoanalysts, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to.
Modern people think the fundamental issue is, do you believe in God? But that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, what do you mean by God? And so let me give you an example of this that will make it clearer. So there's a medieval idea that God is the summum bonum, which means the sum of all that's good, or the essence of all that's good. Okay, you might say, well, I don't believe in that. Now remember, this is the definition of God, right? God is the sum of all that's good. Okay, all right, so you don't believe in that. All right, let's take that apart. Do you believe that some things are better than other things? Well, people will say yes. Okay, so then you believe that there is a scale of good. Okay, is there something that all things that are good share in common? And the answer to that has to be yes, because otherwise you don't have a conception of good, right? The word good implies that across good things, there's some essence. Okay, well, the definition, one medieval definition of God is the essence of good. Well, okay, let's say you don't believe in that. Okay, does that mean you don't believe in anything that's good? Okay, then how do you act then? Because to act means to do something that's better than what you're doing now, right? There's no action without movement towards the good. And well, you might say, well, I don't believe that there's a unitary good. Okay, you believe there's a fractionated good. Well, then what do you do when those things oppose one another, right? Which would be in a conflict of duty. How do you refer to
What do you refer to help you adjudicate between different goods? Well, generally what you do is if you could pursue A, which is good, or B, which is good, and they conflict, then you pick the higher good. Okay, do you believe in a higher good? Well, if you don't, you can't decide between goods, which means you're paralyzed. If you do believe in the higher good, then do you believe in the highest good? Well, the highest good is God. What do you mean by that? By definition. Okay, so now you have a definition. Now, then the next question might be, well, what's your relationship with the highest good? And you might say, well, I don't have a relationship. It's like, well, actually you do, because you act in relationship to it. You can't help it. One of the interesting things about the biblical corpus is that it's based on the insistence that you have a relationship with being and becoming, a relationship, like a personal relationship.
The biblical narrative of paradise and the fall provides a profound account of the nature of being and points the way to a mode of conceptualization and action well matched to that nature. In the Garden of Eden, prior to the dawn of self-consciousness, so goes the story. Human beings were sinless. Our primordial parents, Adam and Eve, walked with God. Then, tempted by the snake, the first couple ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, discovered death and vulnerability, and turned away from God. Mankind was exiled from paradise and began its effortful mortal existence. The idea of sacrifice enters soon afterward, beginning with the account of Cain and Abel, and developing through the Abrahamic adventures and the Exodus. After much contemplation, struggling humanity learns that God's favor could be gained and his wrath averted through proper sacrifice, and also that bloody murder might be motivated among those unwilling or unable to succeed in this manner. When engaging in sacrifice, our forefathers began to act out what would be considered a proposition, if it were stated in words, that something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. The necessity for work is one of the curses placed by God upon Adam and his descendants in consequence of original sin. Adam's waking to the fundamental constraints of his being, his vulnerability, his eventual death, is equivalent to his discovery of the future. The future. That's where you go to die. Hopefully not too soon. Your demise might be staved off through work, through the sacrifice of the now to gain benefit later. It is for this reason, among others, no doubt, that the concept of sacrifice is introduced in the biblical chapter immediately following the drama of the fall. There is little difference between sacrifice and work. They are also both uniquely human. Sometimes animals act as if they are working, but they are really only following the dictates of their nature. Beavers build dams. They do so because they are beavers, and beavers build dams. They don't think, yeah, but I'd rather be on a beach in Mexico with my girlfriend while they're doing it. Prosaically, such sacrifice, work, is delay of gratification, but that's a very mundane phrase to describe something of such profound significance. The discovery that gratification could be delayed was simultaneously the discovery of time and, with it, causality, at least the causal force of voluntary human action. Long ago, in the dim mists of time, we began to realize that reality was structured as if it could be bargained with. We learned that behaving properly now, in the present, regulating our impulses, considering the plight of others, could bring rewards in the future, in a time and place that did not yet exist. We began to inhibit, control, and organize our immediate impulses so that we could stop interfering with other people and our future selves. Doing so was indistinguishable from organizing society. The discovery of the causal relationship between our efforts today and the quality of tomorrow motivated the social contract, the organization that enables today's work to be stored, reliably, mostly in the form of promises from others. Understanding is often acted out before it can be articulated, just as a child acts out what it means to be mother or father before being able to give a spoken account of what those roles mean. The act of making a ritual sacrifice to God was an early and sophisticated enactment of the idea of the usefulness of delay. There is a long conceptual journey between merely feasting hungrily and learning to set aside some extra meat, smoked by the fire, for the end of the day, or for someone who isn't present. It takes a long time to learn to keep anything later for yourself, or to share it with someone else. And those are very much the same thing as, in the former case, you are sharing with your future self. It is much easier and far more likely to selfishly and immediately wolf down everything in sight. There are similar long journeys between every leap in sophistication with regard to delay and its conceptualization. Short-term sharing, storing away for the future, representation of that storage in the form of records, and later in the form of currency, and ultimately the saving of money in a bank or other social institution. Some conceptualizations had to serve as intermediaries, or the full range of our practices and ideas surrounding sacrifice and work, and their representation could have never emerged. Our ancestors acted out a drama, a fiction. They personified the force that governs fate as a spirit that can be bargained with, traded with as if it were another human being. And the amazing thing is that it worked. This was in part because the future is largely composed of other human beings, often precisely those who have watched and evaluated and appraised the tiniest details of your past behavior. It's not very far from that to God, sitting above on high, tracking your every move and writing it down for further reference in a big book. Here's a productive symbolic idea. The future is a judgmental father. That's a good start. But two additional archetypal foundational questions arose because of the discovery of sacrifice, of work. Both have to do with the ultimate extension of the logic of work, which is sacrifice now to gain later. First question. What must be sacrificed? Small sacrifices may be sufficient to solve small, singular problems. But it is possible that larger, more comprehensive sacrifices might solve an array of large and complex problems all at the same time. That's harder, but it might be better. Adapting to the necessary discipline of medical school will, for example, fatally interfere with the licentious lifestyle of a hardcore undergraduate party animal. Giving that up is a sacrifice. But a physician can, to paraphrase George W., really put food on his family. That's a lot of trouble dispensed with over a very long period of time. So sacrifices are necessary to improve the future, and larger sacrifices can be better. Second question, set of related questions really. We've already established the basic principle, sacrifice will improve the future. But a principle, once established, has to be fleshed out. Its full extension or significance has to be understood. What is implied by the idea that sacrifice will improve the future? In the most extreme and final of cases. Where does that basic principle find its limits? We must ask, to begin, what would be the largest, most effective, most pleasing of all possible sacrifices? And then how good might the best possible future be if the most effective sacrifice could be made? The God of Western tradition, like so many gods, requires sacrifice. But sometimes he goes even further. He demands not only sacrifice, but the sacrifice of precisely what is loved best. This is most starkly portrayed and most confusingly evident in the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham, beloved of God, long wanted a son, and God promised him exactly that, after many delays, and under the apparently impossible conditions of old age and a long barren wife. But not so long afterward, when the miraculously born Isaac is still a child, God turns around and in unreasonable and apparently barbaric fashion demands that his faithful servant offer his son as a sacrifice. The story ends happily. God sends an angel to stay Abraham's obedient hand and accepts a ram in Isaac's stead. That's a good thing, but it doesn't really address the issue at hand. Why is God's going further necessary? Why does life impose such demands? We'll start our analysis with a truism, stark, self-evident, and understated. Sometimes things do not go well. That seems to have much to do with the terrible nature of the world, with its plagues and famines and tyrannies and betrayals. But here's the rub. Sometimes when things are not going well, it's not the world that's the cause. The cause is instead that which is currently most valued subjectively and personally. Why? Because the world is revealed to an indeterminate degree through the template of your values. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore, it's time to examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. It's time to let go. It might even be time to sacrifice what you love best so that you can become who you might become instead of staying who you are.
The more radical the necessary change, the more pain that accompanies it. Like the more opportunity as well. And a lot of what we learn painfully. And so it's not surprising that people shrink away from learning. We learn in pain and anxiety very frequently. Everyone knows that. Like the things that you really learned in life, it's like, it was no joy, man. Like it took you out. And so the fact that people flee from that is hardly surprising. But it doesn't help. That's the thing. It just stores up the catastrophe for later. And so the better idea is to eat a little poison every day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. It's something like that. And it is the case that I think because you aren't forced to, first of all, you don't learn unless you're forced to learn. I know there's alternatives to that. There's the voluntary search for knowledge. And that's a fine thing. And that is an antidote to this. But apart from that, speaking more practically, you tend not to learn unless you're forced to learn. And what you tend to learn by force are difficult lessons. And so people are very prone to not seek that out. It's not surprising. But it's because they don't understand the consequences very well. It's because they're convinced that there's some way of forestalling the necessary learning. And there isn't any way of forestalling it. All you do is make it worse in the future. You make yourself smaller and you make the lesson harder. And so that's why in so many religious doctrines, there's emphasis on humility. And humility isn't to debase yourself. It's to understand that you don't know enough so that your life isn't going to be miserable. And so every chance you get to grab something new that will help you along your way, you should take it as fast as you can. But you have to have a very tragic, I would say, view of reality, and also a harsh one, because it's not just tragedy, it's also malevolence. You have to understand that those are waiting for you. And that makes you desperate enough to learn. And that might make you desperate enough to fall out of your ideology. But that's a hard way of looking at the world. It beats living through it, though.
Aim up. Pay attention. Fix what you can fix. Don't be arrogant in your knowledge. Strive for humility, because totalitarian pride manifests itself in intolerance, oppression, torture, and death. Become aware of your own insufficiency, your cowardice, malevolence, resentment, and hatred. Consider the murderousness of your own spirit before you dare accuse others, and before you attempt to repair the fabric of the world. Maybe it's not the world that's at fault. Maybe it's you. You've failed to make the mark. You've missed the target. You've fallen short of the glory of God. You've sinned. And all of that is your contribution to the insufficiency and evil of the world. And above all, don't lie. Don't lie about anything ever. Lying leads to hell. It was the great and the small lies of the Nazi and communist states that produced the deaths of millions of people. Consider then that the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering is a good. Make that an axiom. To the best of my ability, I will act in a manner that leads to the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering. You have now placed at the pinnacle of your moral hierarchy a set of presuppositions and actions aimed at the betterment of being. Why? Because we know the alternative. The alternative was the 20th century. The alternative was so close to hell that the difference is not worth discussing. And the opposite of hell is heaven. To place the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering at the pinnacle of your hierarchy of value is to work to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. That's a state, and a state of mind at the same time.
When you're in chaos and you don't know what's going on, then you start imagining what might be going on. And that imagination is partly the world, as it might be, but it's also partly the structure of your unconscious mind, which is producing the fantasies. And so, when you're truly in chaos, then the distinction between your fantasies and reality isn't clear. That's actually part of what constitutes the chaos. So imagine this. So you're in a relationship and the person betrays you. And you knew who they were, or at least you thought you did, before that moment. But now you're looking at them and you don't know who they are. And you don't know what the past was. And you don't know what the present is.
and you don't know what the future is going to be. All of that's been thrown up into the air in a major way. That's traumatic. So much has fallen apart that it's traumatic. So what do you start to do? You start to imagine what might be the situation. The reality is your imagination and the reality at the same time, they're not pulled apart at all. You cannot distinguish between them. So Pinocchio is in this situation that's half fantasy and half reality, in this chaotic state. And he has to go down to find the thing that he least wants to find. He's got this intuition that in facing that thing, that chaos that life really is, that chaos, that he's going to find his father and reunite with him. So you could also say that in some sense it's a decision of faith, I suppose, because you might ask yourself, well, why bother confronting chaos? If chaos is the ultimate reality, then what the hell use is there in facing it? Because it's just going to reveal itself as the ultimate reality and drown you. But the myths always say the same thing. They say, no, if you confront what's really disturbing you, if you really confront it, you do it voluntarily, you're going to find order in it eventually. Or at least that's the only way you're going to find order. Now, it's not like these stories are optimistic, and it's not as if they give you a sure guide to success. That's the other thing. It's not like they're unerringly accurate, because you can be subsumed by chaos that's so total that even if you face it, you're not going to prevail. I mean, that's why people die. That's one way of looking at it anyways. But the mythology basically says this is your best bet. If there's a process that's going to work, this is it. And then you might think, well, the better you do it, the better the chances are of success, or the more consistently you do it, the better the chances of success are. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. So anyways, Pinocchio's down at the bottom of the ocean, and every time he says he's trying to find out where Monstro is, and they ask questions to the fish that are down there, but every time they mention Monstro's name, all the fish disappear. And it's like Voldemort, right? He's the guy whose name you cannot say. And Monstro is precisely that. It's the thing that frightens everyone. And so asking questions down there isn't helping very much. And so Pinocchio, what he does is he's calling for his father, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into the depths. And there's a scene where the darkness of the ocean turns into an even more profound darkness, and that's what Pinocchio disappears into. And then we see Monstro. He's in this sort of foggy representation, this huge thing that lies very much at the bottom. And there's no life or anything around him except, I think these are mackerel, but there's no life down there. He's so far down at the bottom of the ocean that there's nothing that's alive down there. And then we go inside the whale, which is of course absurd, and we see that the whale has eaten a boat at some point in the past. This is one whopping whale. And Geppetto is sitting with the kitten, of all things. He's also got that little goldfish bowl full of goldfish with him too, which is quite the feat. Anyways, he's sitting there, and he knows that he's trapped in the belly of the whale too, and that he can't get out. And so that's an interesting issue. It's because not only is Pinocchio lacking his father, which isn't a good thing, but the father is lacking the son. And there's some indication that the father can't get out of the whale without the son. And so it's like the possibility for order is down there in this chaotic state, but unless there's an active agent to go seek it out, it's not animated enough to get out by itself. You know, and you could say, well, there's wisdom in the libraries, but without you going in there and gathering it and embodying it, all it does is sit there in potential, in all of that implicit form. That's a good way of thinking about it. So anyways, Geppetto is pretty hopeless because he can't figure out any way of getting out of the whale, and he's also starving. He's starving in the belly of the whale. And here's a way of thinking about that. Geppetto's a good guy, but he's old. And that means his way of doing things is no longer fruitful. That's why he's starving. And it's especially not fruitful because he's missing his son. He's missing the active element that the child represents, say the playful and transformative element that the child represents. And so if you get stuck doing something the same old way, at some point it's no longer going to work. Even if it was good at some point, it has to be updated. And it's updated by, let's call it the spirit of youth, or the spirit of attention, or the spirit of play, something like that. The willingness to break boundaries and take risks. And Geppetto is very, very skilled, but he doesn't have that. And that's symbolized by the loss of his son. That's why he was out looking for his son too. He needs him. And so they're in despair down there, trying to fish and not getting anything. And so monster wakes up and he opens his mouth and a bunch of water starts to come in. And then you see Pinocchio with the fish. Now, you may remember, and perhaps you don't,
the role of the victim, which is a painful role to have because something bad happened to you to be a victim. But it's something that society struggles with. What about people who feel like they're a victim?
they're right. They're victimizers too. Like everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. You know, well, illness strikes people randomly. Yeah. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it. Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existentialists, especially in the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Yep. Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life, and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past or perhaps of the present. You know, and no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than doing that.
I don't care what you're going to do, but go out there and make something of yourself for God's sake. Be an honest person and work and get to the top of whatever it is that you want to get to the top of. You know, and stand up for yourself like a respectable human being and be a bit of a light on the world instead of a blight. You know, and you can tell young people that, and they haven't been told that by anyone now. And so the young men are so hungry for that it's painful to watch. They're so relieved when someone finally comes up and says, hey, you know, you get your act together a bit, discipline yourself, see if you can learn to tell the truth, concentrate on something for a year or two, you could be a bloody world beater. They think, really? That's possible? Wow, that would be interesting. That might make life worth living. It's like, yeah, it might. So why don't you go do it? That's what the damn universities were supposed to be teaching people. And they've forgotten that. I went to Harvard a month and a half. I used to teach there. And I talked to a bunch of students, you know, and I told them, it's not easy to get into Harvard, you know. Like, you're a valedictorian if you're at Harvard. And not only are you a valedictorian, you're way better than most people at least two other things, or you don't get in. And so, like, I don't know what the acceptance rate is, like 5%, and believe me, not everybody applies, so it's a very selective school. And so why am I saying that? It's like, these are high quality kids. So I told them what I just told you. It's like, here you are at Harvard. It's like, get yourself educated, man. Read some books, learn to talk, learn to think. Make yourself into something. Get the hell out there and make the world that put you here happy that you were put there in that great institution. You know, and they came up to me afterwards and said, God, I wish someone would have told us that when we
We're in our first year. It's like, Jesus, why didn't someone tell them that? For God's sake, it's supposed to be the greatest university in the world. Is it so difficult to figure that out?
Standards of better or worse are not illusory or unnecessary. If you hadn't decided that what you are doing right now was better than the alternatives, you wouldn't be doing it. The idea of a value, free choice, is a contradiction in terms. Value judgments are a precondition for action. Furthermore, every activity, once chosen, comes with its own internal standards of accomplishment. If something can be done at all, it can be done better or worse. To do anything at all is therefore to play a game with a defined and valued end, which can always be reached more or less efficiently and elegantly. Every game comes with its chance of success or failure. Differentials in quality are omnipresent. Furthermore, if there was no better and worse, nothing would be worth doing. There would be no value and, therefore, no meaning. Why make an effort if it doesn't improve anything? Meaning itself requires the difference between better and worse. How, then, can the voice of critical self-consciousness be stilled? Where are the flaws in the apparently impeccable logic of its message? We might start by considering the all too black and white words themselves. Success or failure. You are either a success, a comprehensive, singular, overall good thing, or its opposite, a failure, a comprehensive, singular, irredeemably bad thing. The words imply no alternative and no middle ground. However, in a world as complex as ours, such generalizations, such failure to differentiate, are a sign of naive, unsophisticated, or even malevolent analysis. There are vital degrees and gradations of value obliterated by this binary system, and the consequences are not good. To begin with, there is not just one game at which to succeed or fail. There are many games, and more specifically, many good games. Games that match your talents, involve you productively with other people, and sustain and even improve themselves across time. Lawyer is a good game. So is plumber, physician, carpenter, or school teacher. The world allows for many ways of being. If you don't succeed at one, you can try another. You can pick something better matched to your unique mix of strengths, weaknesses, and situation. Furthermore, if changing games does not work, you can invent a new one. I recently watched a talent show featuring a mime who taped his mouth shut and did something ridiculous with oven mitts. That was unexpected. That was original. It seemed to be working for him. It's also unlikely that you're playing only one game. You have a career and friends and family members and personal projects and artistic endeavors and athletic pursuits. You might consider judging your success across all the games you play. Imagine that you are very good at some, middling at others, and terrible at the remainder. Perhaps that's how it should be. You might object. I should be winning at everything. But winning at everything might only mean that you're not doing anything new or difficult. You might be winning, but you're not growing, and growing might be the most important form of winning. Should victory in the present always take precedence over trajectory across time? Finally, you might come to realize that the specifics of the many games you are playing are so unique to you, so individual, that comparison to others is simply inappropriate. Perhaps you are overvaluing what you don't have and undervaluing what you do. There's some real utility in gratitude. It's also good protection against the dangers of victimhood and resentment. Your colleague outperforms you at work. His wife, however, is having an affair while your marriage is stable and happy. Who has it better? The celebrity you admire is a chronic drunk driver and bigot. Is his life truly preferable to yours? When the internal critic puts you down using such comparisons, here's how it operates. First, it selects a single arbitrary domain of comparison, fame, maybe, or power. Then it acts as if that domain is the only one that is relevant. Then it contrasts you unfavorably with someone truly stellar within that domain. It can take that final step even further, using the unbridgeable gap between you and its target of comparison as evidence for the fundamental injustice of life. That way, your motivation to do anything at all can be most effectively undermined. Those who accept such an approach to self-evaluation certainly can't be accused of making things too easy for themselves. But it's just as big a problem to make things too difficult.
When we are very young, we are neither individual nor informed. We have not had the time nor gained the wisdom to develop our own standards. In consequence, we must compare ourselves to others, because standards are necessary. Without them, there is nowhere to go and nothing to do. As we mature, we become, by contrast, increasingly individual and unique. The conditions of our lives become more and more personal and less comparable with those of others. Symbolically speaking, this means we must leave the house ruled by our Father and confront the chaos of our individual being. We must take note of our disarray without completely abandoning that Father in the process. We must then rediscover the values of our culture, veiled from us by our ignorance, hidden in the dusty treasure, trove of the past, rescue them, and integrate them into our own lives. This is what gives existence its full and necessary meaning.
I think what you have to do, and this is part of humility, is you have to look around you within your sphere of influence, like the direct sphere of influence, and fix the things that announce themselves as in need of repair. And those are often small things, and they can be like your room. Put it in order, because the thing is, it isn't exactly so important that your room is in order, although it is. What's important is that you learn how to distinguish between chaos and order, and to be able to act in a manner that produces order. And I think you can do something as simple as just sit on your bed and think, okay, there's probably like 5 things I could do today so that tomorrow morning is slightly better than this morning was. Or at least I'm not falling behind. And those will usually be, it's like having to eat a toad in the morning, right? It's like, it's not going to be something you want to do. There'll be things you're trying to avoid. They're snakes, essentially. But if you ask yourself, like you're asking someone, which I think is a form of prayer, if you ask yourself, instead of telling yourself, what is it that I could do to set things more right today that I would actually do? It's usually some small thing because you're not that disciplined, Then you can go do it. And then you put the world together a little more when you do that. And that spreads out. But you also construct yourself into something that's better able to call order forth from chaos. And that makes you just incrementally stronger. And then the next day, you can maybe take on a slightly larger task. And you get the benefit of compound interest if you do that. It's a tremendously powerful technique. And I think if you do that, at some point, instead of just having to fix things up that are not good, you'll start to get a glimmer of the positive things that you could do, the positive things that you could do that would actually constitute a vision. And that's what I would recommend.
Who are you? You think you know, but maybe you don't. You are, for example, neither your own master nor your own slave. You cannot easily tell yourself what to do and compel your own obedience, any more than you can easily tell your husband, wife, son, or daughter what to do and compel their... You are interested in some things and not in others. You can shape that interest, but there are limits. Some activities will always engage you, and others simply will not. You have a nature. You can play the tyrant to it, but you will certainly rebel. How hard can you force yourself to work and sustain your desire to work? How much can you sacrifice to your partner before generosity turns to resentment? What is it that you actually love? What is it that you genuinely want? Before you can articulate your own standards of value, you must see yourself as a stranger, and then you must get to know yourself. What do you find valuable or pleasurable? How much leisure, enjoyment, and reward do you require so that you feel like more than a beast of burden? How must you treat yourself so you won't kick over the traces and smash up your coral? You could force yourself through your daily grind and kick your dog in frustration when you come home. You could watch the precious days tick by, or you could learn how to entice yourself into sustainable, productive activity. Do you ask yourself what you want? Do you negotiate fairly with yourself? Or are you a tyrant with yourself as slave? When do you dislike your parents, your spouse, or your children? And why? What might be done about that? What do you need and want from your friends and your business partners? This is not a mere matter of what you should want. I'm not talking about what other people require from you or your duties to them. I'm talking about determining the nature of your moral obligation to yourself.
might enter into it because you are nested within a network of social obligations. Should is your responsibility, and you should live up to it. But this does not mean you must take the role of lap, dog, obedient, and harmless. That's how a dictator wants his slaves. Dare, instead, to be dangerous. Dare to be truthful. Dare to articulate yourself and express, or at least become aware of, what would really justify your life if you allowed your dark and unspoken desires for your partner, for example, to manifest themselves, if you were even willing to consider them. You might discover that they were not so dark, given the light of day. You might discover, instead, that you were just afraid, and so pretending to be moral. You might find that getting what you actually desire would stop you from being tempted and straying. Are you so sure that your partner would be unhappy if more of you rose to the surface? The femme fatale and the anti-hero are sexually attractive for a reason. How do you need to be spoken to? What do you need to take from people? What are you putting up with or pretending to like from duty or obligation? Consult your resentment. It's a revelatory emotion. For all its pathology, it's part of an evil triad: arrogance, deceit, and resentment. Nothing causes more harm than this underworld trinity. But resentment always means one of two things. Either the resentful person is immature, in which case he or she should shut up, quit whining, and get on with it, or there is tyranny afoot, in which case the person subjugated has a moral obligation to speak up. Why? Because the consequence of remaining silent is worse. Of course, it's easier in the moment to stay silent and avoid conflict. But in the long term, that's deadly. When you have something to say, silence is a lie, and tyranny feeds on lie. When should you push back against oppression despite the danger? When you start nursing secret fantasies of revenge. When your life is being poisoned and your imagination fills with the wish to devour and destroy. I had a client decades ago who suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. He had to line up his pajamas just right before he could go to sleep at night. Then he had to fluff his pillow. Then he had to adjust the bed sheets. Over and over and over and over. I said, maybe that part of you, that insanely persistent part, wants something, inarticulate though it may be. Let it have its say. What could it be? He said, control. I said, close your eyes and let it tell you what it wants. Don't let fear stop you. You don't have to act it out just because you're thinking it. He said, it wants me to take my stepfather by the collar, put him up against the door, and shake him like a rat. Maybe it was time to shake someone like a rat, although I suggested something a bit less primal. But God only knows what battles must be fought, forthrightly, voluntarily, on the road to peace. What do you do to avoid conflict? Necessary though it may be. What are you inclined to lie about, assuming that the truth might be intolerable? What do you fake? The infant is dependent on his parents for almost everything he needs. The child, the successful child, can leave his parents, at least temporarily, and make friends. He gives up a little of himself to do that, but gains much in return. The successful adolescent must take that process to its logical conclusion. He has to leave his parents and become like everyone else. He has to integrate with the group so he can transcend his childhood dependency. Once integrated, the successful adult then must learn how to be just the right amount different from everyone else. Be cautious when you're comparing yourself to others. You're a singular being once you're an adult. You have your own particular specific problems, financial, intimate, psychological, and otherwise. Those are embedded in the unique, broader context of your existence. Your career or job works for you in a personal manner, or it does not, and it does so in a unique interplay with the other specifics of your life. You must decide how much of your time to spend on this, and how much on that. You must decide what to let go and what to pursue. You need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, well, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because they need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failure. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal. So that's one way of looking at it. But then the next thing is, I've had clients, many clients in their 30s, who are trying to, this is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate out their life. They want to have a husband, they want to have a family, they're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I've noticed that around 30, you really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. So here's a good goal. It's something like, well, aim high. And I really mean that. It's like, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Aim high, but use as your control yourself. It's like, so your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better, you can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. You think, okay, well, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. And, well, that's a great thing because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. And I've seen that happen in people's lives over and over. People write me all the time and tell me that they're doing that, but I've seen that happen in people's lives continually. They make a goal that, the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. And that's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well, because life is very hard. So you think, okay, well, I need to adopt a mode of being that would justify my suffering. And you can ask yourself that question. What would make this worthwhile? I quote Nietzsche, I think in that chapter, he said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." That's a lovely line, man. I mean, it's a lovely line. And it's really worth thinking about. So you think, well, how do I manage all this misery and suffering and futility? It's like, well, I need to figure out what I would have to do in order to make that clearly worthwhile. And so then you have your goal, and then you think, well, I need to move towards that incrementally because I'm kind of useless and can only do so much and maybe not even that. But all I have to do is be a little bit better than my miserable self yesterday. And that'll propel you forward very rapidly. And you can succeed at it, which is also really lovely, because why not set yourself up for success, because otherwise you'll droop around like a number 10 lobster, and, that's just not good. You get all pinchy when that happens, and it's not a good thing.
Identity to me is something that's practical. It's like a dramatic role that you play out in the world. And while playing that out, it has to furnish you with a life. It means that it has to be negotiated with other people. And when you're a very young child and you first start to play with who you are, you live in a fantasy world. And so that means identity has to expand beyond its egocentric focus and increasingly be negotiated in the social world. Now imagine that you're lonely and you approach a young woman in a social situation, attempting to make some contact with her. You want to alleviate your loneliness, and so you hope you make a good impression, and you tell a joke, let's say, in a relatively awkward manner, and you get rebuffed, then you're no longer where you control. You're no longer where you exercise control. And that brings up all sorts of specters immediately. It's like, well, why were you rebuffed? Well, maybe all women are to be despised. That's one theory. Maybe there's something deeply wrong with you. Maybe you're having an off day. Maybe it wasn't a very good joke. So when you don't get what you want, then a landscape of questions emerge, and those questions can resonate through different levels of your identity, from the trivial, oh, I told the joke wrong, to the profound, there's nothing desirable about me and I'll be alone for the rest of my life. It has to go through that period before you can emerge as a genuine individual, which means you have to know the rules of the game before you can break them. But not being able to abide by the rules is not anything like being a genuine creative individual. Those are not the same thing. And there's plenty of attempt to confuse the two things, because it's much better, if you can't follow the rules, to view yourself as a avant-garde revolutionary than as a failure. And it's not like I don't know that social molding crushes. Obviously, it crushes, and everyone feels that. These are existential problems. Everyone deals with the tyranny of culture and the fact that it does want you to be a certain way and not other ways, and those ways might not be in keeping with the deepest elements of your nature. Well, tough luck for you, because you're also the beneficiary of culture. And so you have to offer it your pound of flesh. Now, you shouldn't do that at the expense of your soul, but you shouldn't stay an immature child either. So what happens is that if you act out your identity, if you act out your beliefs in the world, and what you want doesn't happen, what happens is that your body defaults into emergency preparation for action. And the reason for that is you've wandered too far away from the campfire, and now you're in the forest, and maybe you're naked. And so what do you do then? And the answer is, well, you don't know what to do. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? And the answer is, you prepare to do everything. And the problem with that is that it's unbelievably draining psychophysiologically. Like, it hurts you. People stay where what they do has the results they want. That's partly why you want to be around people who share your cultural presuppositions. It's very hard on us not to be where we know that what we want is going to happen. We hate that. By and large, we're conservative creatures, even if we're liberal in temperament. We can't tolerate that much uncertainty. And you might ask, well, why? And the answer is, well, because you can be hurt, pain, you can be damaged, you can become intolerably anxious, and you can die. So it's no wonder you're sensitive, or very sensitive, to negative emotion. And so functional identity regulates your emotion, but you do that in concert with other people. If you're acceptable to your peers and you behave well, they'll accept you. And then they tell you all the time if you're acting appropriately. You know, if your jokes are funny, if you're dominating the conversation, if you're bringing something of value to the table. And all you have to do is pay attention to the social cues. We've been social for so long that our social nature is programmed into our biology. And so you'll be punished if you're not useful to other people by your conscience, because you're a social creature. What if you think that's all pointless? Well, that doesn't seem very helpful. Okay, so you need a sustaining meaning. Well, where do you find that? Well, you generally find it in responsibility to yourself and to other people. When I commit to something and make sacrifices, if something's valuable, you'll make sacrifices to attain it. And that discovery of sacrifice, it's one of the primary factors separating human beings from animals. Because we discovered that we could let go of something we value in the present, and we would gain something we value even more in the future. We acted that out dramatically in all sorts of strange ways over thousands and thousands of years before it was formalizable psychologically. But it's a massive discovery. I can forego gratification in a particular way and benefit in the future. You make sacrifices to make the future better. Well, what if that doesn't pay off? Well, think about that. You know what that's like. You endeavor to do something and it doesn't work. You're not appreciated for who you are. You fail. Maybe you fail despite your best efforts. Well, Are you rejected by God? Well, it's as if you're rejected by God. Does it make you resentful? Does it make you bitter? Does it make you want to pull down the successful? The answer to that happens to be yes. It's harsh that the rewards of life are indiscriminately distributed. It's hard on everyone, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help to become bitter. And it's not like I don't understand the temptation. And I see this in this culture war. I see this resentment. It colors the definition of identity. This attack on meritocracy. It's an attack on merit itself. You're lucky that there's such a thing as a job, or better yet, a career. You're lucky that there's such a thing as friendship, as marriage. All of these social institutions. And how do we know when something needs to be changed? We don't know. So we have to argue about it. And in order to argue about it effectively, we have to be able to talk to each other across our identity boundaries. And then we can decide, well, should this be maintained or should this be transformed? We have to strive not to be wretched. There's something that doesn't seem fair about that. Why couldn't we just be happy being who and what we are? Why is it that we're punished if we don't strive? Well, I don't know. We're negentropic organisms, right? I mean, we have to maintain this incredible complexity in the face of a dissipating universe. It requires effort. The positive emotion that we find sustaining is experienced in relationship to an unachieved goal. It's hope that drives us forward. We want something, and if we see ourselves moving towards that, then we're in the grip of the positive emotion that we find sustaining. It isn't the attainment. Attainment is satiating. Attainment shuts down the system that has been striving for that particular object of attainment. If you're hungry and you eat, you stop being hungry. Now, that's good because the hunger is gone, but that whole frame disappears. You can no longer strive within that frame, and you need a new frame to strive towards. Don't you have a conscience? Doesn't it bother you? And then, can you control it? And the answer to that is almost inevitably no. It calls you to account. And why? Well, because you've deviated from the ideal. Whose ideal? An ideal that's making itself known within you, at least insofar as the objection arises. You wake up at 3 a.m. and torture yourself for your iniquities. And you would think, well, I could just shut that off. It's me, after all. But you can't shut it off. You're nothing compared to your conscience. Now, it's strange because you can ignore it. You can not live according to its dictates, but it's not going to leave you alone. I took what I learned about what happened in the Second World War seriously. It's like, wow, we can be really bad. We should do something about that. Like, that was unacceptable. We're getting so powerful that each individual is now a force of almost unimaginable destructive power if they so choose to be. That power is going to continue to increase. And what that means is that the degree to which each of us has our act together is going to be something upon which the world increasingly depends for its maintenance. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. I don't understand, really. And it's really killing me, I think. I might mean that literally. I don't understand why I'm so controversial. I can't figure that out. It's very distressing to me. I'm ashamed, of what's happened to me.
What do you mean?
And I'm very hurt. I'm a very destroyed person in many ways. And so I feel unworthy.
Unworthy of what?
Oh, you name it. I hope people find it useful. I hope it alleviates some unnecessary suffering. That's
Sure.
the goal. I'm very fortunate in that regard. I get letters from people all the time that they open up their hearts It's really something. But I am somewhat nonplussed, let's say, for all this work. I'm pretty broken. It's not easy to know what to do with, the cheers of 1 million people. It's overwhelming. It's dangerous. I don't think I've unfairly benefited from it. I'm not a hedonistic person. My lifestyle hasn't changed. I think there's more of me outside of me now than there is inside of me. When I put those first videos up, this was bothering me, this piece of legislation. And I talked to my wife and my son sort of casually. I said, well, I'm going to make these videos, see what happens. And famous last words. The best we have might not always work, but it's still the best we have. And the fact that it might not work doesn't mean we should throw it away. It's still the best we have. I mean, everyone dies, and so we fail in some sense. The fact that a symphony ends doesn't mean that it wasn't worth listening to.